then they can. And really, the purpose of this is we're kind of towards the end of our looking at the law. It's talking about, all right, you've learned about the historical side, you've learned about even recent court cases, but let's talk about what this means in everyday life. What it's like to be an administrator and that reality, practical side of things. Does that sound good? Don't hesitate to ask questions or anything like that. Now, I sent 2 articles. If you didn't read it, it's okay. You're not going to get an F. But one was North Carolina, and that school is actually less than a mile. I can see it out my front door, the charter school. And the other one is actually in Columbia, South Carolina, where one of my... You're familiar with that. Okay, so one of my former teachers just finished his first year there. And we'll talk a little bit about that article, probably more when we talk about tort, but I do want to address just some points of that article about the Hell at Hand Middle School, which I thought was kind of a catchy little title. Let's talk about, and I just kind of made an outline based on some of the things that you guys have read and written about. Let's talk about student free speech. So this is all from a student perspective. And by the way, you guys did a fantastic job of your court cases. I mean, your case studies and talking it out and looking at, well, what about this side and what about that side and what would I do and all of that. So one of the biggest things that every group said in their case studies, and I just haven't put the grades in there, I've watched them, but I haven't put the grades in all of them, is everybody said you got to look at your board policy. And that is absolutely correct. When you become an administrator, or even now in whatever role you hold, those board policies are basically your Bible. That's what you have to abide by as an employee. So exactly right. In looking at board policy, you won't necessarily find board policy on student rights. You'll find some, but you won't find a ton. You won't find like the free speech board policy. A lot of that will be in the student code of conduct, but then again, you will find that those board policies are very vague. So in free speech, so in the education world as administrators, you will hear these court cases referred to by usually one word, like the Tinker case. It's referred to just as the Tinker case. But it's important to know, even though it was 1969, you have to think about what was going on in the world in 1969. Vietnam, a lot of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a lot of integration, especially in North Carolina. The 60s and 70s is when they integrated their schools. So even though the civil rights movement was earlier than that, in North Carolina, or at least in the South, they didn't necessarily integrate their schools. I know in Gaston County, we didn't integrate until 1969, 70, 71 timeframe. So you have to think about what was going on in the world. Just like this past year, we experienced the Black Lives Matter movement, which is a part of what's going on in this world. And so we as school administrators had to be prepared and at a high school, talk to students about what their rights are, what will get them in trouble. But what came out of the Tinker case was some language that talked about the materially and substantially interfering with the requirements of appropriate discipline in the operation of the school. And that is a phrase you will hear over and over and over again, whether it's freedom of speech, whether it's freedom of expression, whether it's any type of activity in a school. Sorry, we've got a storm where I am. That scared me. I've had some lightning. But also with students, they don't get rid of their constitutional rights at the door. They have their constitutional rights. They have freedom of speech, but it's limited because of the purpose of why you're here. So let me tell you about some free speech issues that I've had to deal with. So let's talk about the first time President Obama was elected. I was working in a middle school that was racially 60% majority, 40% minority. So when, and I will say this 60% majority, well, almost all of them, I would say maybe 80% of the school was country. So that is another factor to put in there, because when President Obama was running, all of a sudden we saw an increase of Confederate flag shirts. We saw an increase of President Obama, pro-President Obama shirts. And as a school staff, we kind of said, we're not going to shy away from this. This is our nation. We're going to talk about this. We're going to talk to students about it. But with free speech, it states, you know, in our text, it talks about a material disruption. So, do you think somebody wearing a Confederate flag shirt to school would cause a material disruption?
Yes.
It could, based on the fact that the person wore it. What type of disruption do you think it would cause, Clive?
It's caused a disruption because at the time the President Obama became president, and it's sending a message that I'm showing my disapproval of this person becoming a president. Maybe because, well, the fact that he's an African American. Mm-hmm. So I will say yes, it's causing some disruption because of the timing.
No, I would agree, it did, because the Confederate flag shirts, all of a sudden we saw more pro-Obama shirts. And so then it was divisive. Now, it's stated in our text that that the First Amendment, we can have editorial control over the content of free speech, but if you look at the actual dress code, which was later on in Chapter 5, it said in there that student speech cannot be suppressed for the sole reason someone may be offended or create an outburst in response to the speech. So it would be wrong for a school administrator to tell someone you cannot wear that Confederate flag shirt. Just like it would be wrong for me or any school administrator to say you cannot wear your President Obama, pro-President Obama shirt, because it may offend somebody. But it also talked about, when our text talked about written expression, especially when it came to internet, the internet or another place where it talked about if the school feels that there might be a substantial disruption.
Right.
And also we talked about the heckler's veto. So, you know, when you're talking about free speech, especially with divisive issues, there is a very fine line. You know, did we as a school want to have the school divided? No. But because people came and complained because of the Confederate flag, I couldn't necessarily say, well, you're not allowed to wear it, because it didn't cause a material and substantial disruption. It was ticking some people off. Just like when President Obama was even elected, there were a lot of shirts that said, you know, he is my president. And we used to say he's everybody's president. He is the nation's president. And trying to not make it a racial issue, trying not to make it a divisive issue. But I also during that time had issues where students had hidden undershirts, like they had a button-down plaid shirt, and under it they had a Confederate flag shirt. And every time they saw a minority student, they would open up their shirt and flash a Confederate flag. Now that is a material and substantial disruption. That's taunting. Mm-hmm. Then we could do something about it. Mm-hmm. So let me give you an example of free speech this year that I had to deal with. Had a senior who in March became very angry because we were shortening his day to just first period, which is all he needed to graduate, because his behaviors were so disruptive. He wanted to be a reality TV star, and he was using our classrooms as his stage for audition. Yep. He felt that he could, when he graduated, he was moving to Atlanta, and felt that he could walk into Tyler Perry Studios and that he would hire him on the spot for his reality shows. We kindly let him know, you won't get past a security guard. You know, you gotta go with something better than that. But he was using our classrooms as his stage of reality TV. And it was becoming very disruptive. And he had very patient teachers. And when those 4 teachers marched into my office and said, we are done, we had to do something about it. So we called a meeting with his parents. We sat down and said, we're done. This is not going to happen. He became angry. He stormed off. The parents were very supportive. So the day that he was supposed to start that just coming to first period, he decided, that he was going to not be very quiet about it. And he skipped his first period, was walking off our campus while he was on Facebook Live. And he did an 11 plus minute video where his profanity was unbelievable. I mean, it was about every other word. Spoke very negatively about the assistant principal that oversees his alphabet. And now, mind you, we are not a BYOD school, and it was during class time. So it brought up another issue of why were students allowed in class to have their phones out, because all of a sudden you saw these students streaming comments, liking it. It was during class instruction. So it was to a point where he eventually left our campus, and we have a Dunkin' Donuts next door, and he was at Dunkin' Donuts. He's been banned from Dunkin' Donuts, so they started to come out to tell him to get off their property for his same reality shenanigans. With all of that said, he had a little bit of discipline, but he didn't have a lot, but there was a lot of teacher documentation. So we had to make a decision, because it was a material, it was materially and substantially interfering with the requirements of appropriate discipline. As we've said, it had disrupted our teaching, it disrupted our school. We decided we needed to do something rather drastic. And in my district, you have one of two choices. We could do a short-term suspension. We felt that due to the reaction and how public it was, that maybe would not be appropriate enough, and we did not want other students to feel that this was accepted behavior. So we went for alternative school placement. We have alternative school placement. We have long-term, where they're out for at least a semester. We chose not to long-term him because he needed to, he only needed one class to graduate. He could graduate. He needed to move on so he could go to Tyler Perry Studio and get on a reality show. So we went for an alternative hearing, and it was for disruptive behavior. And we knew that we were risking a little bit, but we had the support of the family, and we also had a copy of the video that we showed at the hearing. Now, they only went through about 2 minutes of it because of the horrific language, and the fact that his grandmother was sitting there beating him with her cane out because she was so upset with the way he presented himself. And that was a little bit of a risk because it was through social media. Of the 11 plus minutes, the majority was off our campus. And he was trying to say we didn't have the right to have him go to the alternative school because of free speech. But because it was Facebook Live, and because I had teachers who were not following our cell phone policy, letting the kids watch it on Facebook Live and streaming comments, that really helped our case. The hearing panel did decide to place him at the alternative school, and felt that it did disrupt our education very drastically. So there are some free speech when you're talking about verbal speech. Now, the Tinker case was silent armbands. So this year, I don't know if any of you had to deal with or had any issues at your school with the Black Lives Matter movement that happened in the fall?
No, I did not. However, I have a situation where I noticed kids in my class will wear colors that are associated with gangs,
Yes.
actually bandanas.
Mm-hmm.
And these were colors that we knew that were involved with gangs, but we take it away from them.
Yep.
However, at some point, there was one day in particular, all the kids wear tops, t-shirts
Mm-hmm.
of the same color. And the school did not know how to deal with it at that time, but we went ahead and we provide them with t-shirts.
Uh-huh.
Now, what's the freedom of expression there?
Well, again, you have to show a substantial disruption, and it can be a perceived substantial disruption. You know, in our book on page 123, it talks a lot about dress code, and then it talks later on about gangs specifically, and page 127 is the gang stuff. But in the dress code, it talks about how school officials could reasonably forecast a disruption due to the shirts rather than agreeing that there was in fact a disruption. But it says in the gang portion of it that when gang activities endanger the educational process and safety of students, schools have the right to regulate students' dress and actions during school hours and on school grounds. But it goes on to talk about the vagueness on the next page. It says regulations in the areas of gangs, cults, and so forth must be specific. So the recommendation is in your dress code, you can't, so if the color is pink, I know the color is probably not pink, but let's just say for argument's sake, the color's pink. Right. If all of a sudden you have, 25 people that show up with pink on the same day, you can't put in your school dress code, no pink. You just can't. I mean, that's an unrealistic expectation. You can put in your dress code, no bandanas, which most dress codes have that. You can put in your dress code, no gang signs, no gang taggings or symbols or emblems of gangs. But a lot of gang members, especially like if you're a part of the Bloods, you may wear Chicago Bulls number 23 because it's red. The 2 and the 3 add up to 5, which is the number of the Bloods. And so you get around it. You can't say you can't wear a Michael Jordan Chicago Bulls shirt. There are ways that students are going to get around it. What you have to do in that instance is target. I shouldn't use the word target. I don't mean target in a negative way, but you need to look specifically at those individual children and look at them all wearing the same color. Was it a material disruption? How did it disrupt? Can you prove that disruption? And try to hit it from an individual standpoint. Now, if your school doesn't have no bandanas, I'd put no bandanas in there. I will be honest with you, I made the mistake at my previous school. We were having a lot of problems with Latino gangs, and one of their number one symbols was the rosary. Well, we couldn't necessarily ban the rosary because they have freedom of religion and to wear and express their religion however they want. So I say a little bit of trouble. We put that in our handbook one year, and a student made an issue of it. It came out the next year, and what we had to do was we had to look at the disruptive behavior. No longer in Gaston County will a student be accused of any type of gang-related activity. The student will be accused or suspended, long-term disciplined for disruptive behavior. Now, it may be gang behavior, but it's disruptive behavior. How did your school handle that, Clive?
We went ahead and we provide these students with white T-shirts.
Shirts. And how many kids were we talking about?
We're talking about 7 to 8 kids, but it set off other kids who were associated with another gang. And they felt like they were being violated. So there was some disruption.
There,
So
and it wasn't necessarily the heckler's veto. It wasn't because they were offended. It was
no,
foreseeable or actual disruption.
it was actual disruption. It didn't amount to major disruption because
Mm-hmm.
we recognized what was going on and
Right.
we nip it in the butt right there.
Yeah. And that's really with anything that is in violation that is going to cause a disruption, you want to minimize it
Right.
as much as you can. 7 or 8 kids, easy peasy. You can minimize that. You gave them white shirts. They probably hated it. I would say, as from an administrative standpoint, you want to make sure that you communicate and contact parents. Now,
Parents
there's
parents were contacted. Parents were in agreement with the school in issuing white T-shirts and also promised to, bring clothing to school, which of course never happened. Some kids choose to leave for the day, so things went smooth. But had we not recognized it, things would have gone a different way.
Did you or did the school see with those same 7 or 8 or the other group that was offended, did you see some other patterns or some other signs?
The ones that were offended actually threatened to wear their colors the following day.
Mm-hmm.
And the principal outlined, called the leaders of the pack and basically have conference with them and outline the student handbook, and things got quiet for a while, but then it went back with some time after.
Yeah. Gangs can be a very touchy subject, just being honest with you. And I've worked in schools that actually, when I was an assistant principal, when we moved from the homegrown gangs to more the nationally affiliated gangs, and they can be a very touchy subject. Now, the reality is that true gang members will say who they are. And, talking to the leader of that gang, saying, hey, cool your people down. Do not do this. Don't bring on, these issues, and just try to have the school be a safe, neutral zone. But gang issues as a whole can be very difficult. There have been multiple Office of Civil Rights cases against gang members saying that they are going to have issue with have issue with the restrictions of the gang. So, I do think that is a little bit of an issue that is really beyond like dress code and freedom of speech. It is more on the issue of school safety and security, which it also states in the dress code, in the written expression, in all of these student rights, that as an administrator, if you feel that the safety and security of your students is at risk, let's take something that's put on the internet. Was done at home. Nobody has anything to, they say, but I did it at home from my phone. I wasn't at school. You have to look at, did it mention specifics? A lot of times you'll get a kid in that will say, here, I'm going to show you this message that, Susie Q sent me that said, I'm going to beat you up. Well, just because she put that out there doesn't mean that it's a disruption to school. She didn't say, I'm going to beat you up after first period tomorrow in the cafeteria. There weren't specifics on there. So then you have to look at that. Is it disruptive? Are there a ton of kids coming up to Jenny saying, hey, are you going to fight Susie today? And that sounds very drama, but that's the reality. And so there's that fine line, and you have to look at that disruption. And that is what you need to guide every single one of your decisions. Was it disruptive? How was it disruptive? And remember, disruptive is a broad topic. But if you can prove, like Clive talked about with the shirts and how it was disruptive to the other members of the gang or people who were scared, because of the other gang members or whatever, then there's a disruption there. I don't work in CMS.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
Mommy, I want
a question for you, Dr. Wilson. So
Yeah.
if a student came up to you, because as counselors, I think that happens a lot, where the kids come to you like as an advocate, and they'll say, oh, well, this is what the message said, or this is what so-and-so is saying. So you hear that information, but don't let on to the fact that, well, I'm going to jump right on this, because I guess if other kids are coming up and you're hearing it more and more, then at least you're open to all the information. Or do you try to minimize it and say, this is something that happened at home? I mean, you don't want the kid to feel unsupported, but.
Right. I mean, you do need to support them, and you do need to investigate it. And that goes to, the other right for students is due process.
Right.
And due process is afforded to everybody, the victim as well.
Okay. And let me, I
Yeah.
got to piggyback off of that.
Sure.
Would that be where the SRO comes in handy?
It depends on the relationship you have with your SRO.
Yeah.
We have a full-time SRO, but what you have to remember is that SRO is bound by different legal guidelines than the school officials. We'll take search and seizure for a minute. The school official is bound by reasonable suspicion. The kid checked in late. That could be reasonable suspicion. Somebody said that Clive had something in his book bag. That's reasonable suspicion. Where a police officer is bound by probable cause.
Mm-hmm.
So I always say, if there is a threat that's made on social media, we always let our police officer know. But a threat, at least in the state of North Carolina, is not something that can be carried out through cyber. That is considered some cyberbullying, and that's a different statute. A threat cannot be heard by a third party. It has to say, Sonia, I'm going to beat you up, and you just heard it. So that is a threat. To me, you always keep your police officer, your resource officer informed if you have one. Of course, with guns, somebody threatening to bring a gun to school, I immediately go to my police officer and have him talk about it, deal with it, all of that kind of stuff. With something like Susie says she's going to beat Jenny up, I do believe in using the counselors for it. I will say at the high school level, the counselors don't necessarily get involved as much in that. A lot of times the administrators deal with it and try to do some mediation, trying to figure out, is there a substantial threat there? Where do Jenny and Susie see each other? Are other people saying, oh, well, Jenny's saying she's going to do it, or Susie's saying she's going to do it in the bathroom at lunchtime? And then you always keep your police officer informed of that. So working with your police officer, my resource officer and I have constant conversations, because the other part is I carry, and so do the other administrators, in loco parentis. And I had a situation this year where a city officer, we have county, city, and other small municipalities. We have a county officer as our resource officer, but this girl had done something outside of school, and it was in the city of Gastonia limits. So a city officer, a detective, came to question her. Well, they didn't read her Miranda rights. They were questioning her about a crime. She was not in their custody by any means. Well, they have to read her Miranda rights. And so as the administrator, I don't let anybody talk to our students without having one of us present. We also, now the police get a little funny about this, but in our county at 16, the police can talk to our students about anything that they want. But under the age of 16, we have to get parental consent, even though the police don't have to abide by that.
Does that apply also in school or out of school?
In school. And that is our county policy. Out of school, it's whatever is the constitutional. They can talk to anybody. But unless they're under custody, that person can disagree and say, no, I don't want to talk to you. I'm not in your custody.
Does that also apply to a school administrator in terms of a student comes in late, like you mentioned before,
Right.
and there's a suspicion that a student might be bringing in drug or a weapon to school? You're saying that the administrator has the right to search that student
Under reasonable suspicion.
but however, the school resource officer cannot.
The resource officer doesn't have a right to search the student, period, without having probable cause. Now, you know, you want to work in tandem. You're not against each other. So a lot of times we have a security officer, which is not a police officer, and a police officer. But when I worked in a middle school, yeah, we have one that we have a he's a retired firefighter, actually, who goes and gets like escorts and things. And then we also have a school resource officer that is a police officer. But so our security officer can search under the same things as school administrators. But even when I worked in a middle school, a school administrator, no matter the age of the child, can search. They can search cars, they can search lockers, they can search book bags, anything that's on school grounds under reasonable suspicion. You do not have to have probable cause. You do not have to have a search warrant, anything like that. Now, a police officer has the right to search if, and I forget the exact wording, but basically if public safety is at risk. If somebody says Rebecca has a gun, you better move out of the way as an administrator, and that police officer is going to search, because it's in fear that a student of school safety, of any type of safety. I think they use some fancy terms when it comes to that.
Is it imminent danger?
Yes, thank you, imminent danger. So with that, if somebody says, hey, I think Rebecca's got drugs, the police officer can't search,
right?
But school administrators can.
Now,